Pode ser o Grupo Corpo ou a Companhia de Dança do Pantanal. Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo. Ou Arte em Cores. Filarmônica de Minas Gerais. Ou Programa Vale Música. Restauração do Museu Nacional. Ou da Crítica da Basílica de Nazaré. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Dos projetos que todo mundo já conhece, até aqueles projetos que todo mundo precisa conhecer. A cultura brasileira tem o nosso apoio. É valorizando essa cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
A sustentabilidade de um ecossistema é construída por muitas mãos. Ela passa pela preservação e cuidado com o meio ambiente, pela cultura, economia, inclusão social, no acesso à saúde e diversas outras áreas. Viu só? Existe um grande universo pertinho de nós e a eletronuclear ajuda a cuidar dele. Você vem com a gente?
Para ti, como eu faço isso, né? Eu creio que com certeza eu tenho um desejo muito bom que venha cada dia melhorar, com certeza, né? Porque o meu pensamento é esse, do futuro de Paraty, né? Ter um futuro igual eu tenho na minha mente. De ver um futuro, que é um futuro bom. As coisas que eu tenho na minha mente é um futuro bom. Então, se não todo, mas se cada um for fazendo um pouquinho, acho que vai ser muito, muito bacana. A minha expectativa é essa, de eu saber que Paraty está nessa aí. Mas é a nossa mente, não tem assim uma coisa assim de você pegar e pensar que é tão fácil, igual eu faço lá. É a coisa mais fácil, a coisa mais fácil. Mas você tem que ter o amor para fazer, né? Separar tudo, lá tudo é comida, é óleo, é o que vai para fazer a compostagem, tudo, né? Tudo. Então você tem que ter amor para fazer isso. Se você não tiver, não consegue fazer, né?
Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade. Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 21ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A Flip conta com benefício da Lei de Incentivo à Cultura, Lei Rouanet, PRONAC 231427, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiência física, visual e auditiva. tem patrocínio Master, Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Ouro, Itaú. CCR e Caixa. Patrocínio Prata, o Globo, Mac Imóveis e Sebrae. Patrocínio Bronze, Globo Livros e Eletronuclear. Parceria institucional SESC. Prefeitura de Paraty, Embratur e Museu do Território. É uma concepção, Associação Casa Azul. Realização, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Boa tarde. Eu sou Milena Brito, uma das curadoras da Flip com a Fernanda Bastos. Essa mesa é uma mesa que tem um título muito maravilhoso, O Meu Primeiro Amor, que acabou com o Segundo. E é uma mesa que vai ter uma conversa interessante, porque toda a nossa experiência de vida não é possível sem uma memória e uma relação com a música. Então, essa conversa é sobre essas relações. A gente vai ter aqui o Kelefa Sanneh conversando com a Adriana Couto. A Adriana Couto, ela é jornalista cultural, apresentadora do programa Metrópolis, e ela, além de ser uma idealizadora, é também apresentadora de um podcast maravilhoso, que é Música Preta. Então, a gente tem hoje as duas fazendo, as duas vozes que estão íntimas dessas relações culturais, fazendo esse passeio por essas memórias. Acho que vai ser uma conversa divertida para começar a nossa tarde. Muito obrigada.
Oiê, boa tarde, gente. Oi, meu amor. Que bom, estamos juntos aqui. Por favor. Nessa chuvinha de Paraty, vamos falar sobre música e literatura? Vamos nessa? Muito obrigada pela presença de todos, todas e todes. Eu sou a Adriana Couto, é um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Eu estou aqui com o Kelefa Sanneh, que é um prazer estar com ele aqui. Sou muito fã, estamos aqui com o livro nas mãos, e é um livro muito especial. Queria apresentar um pouco, falar um pouco sobre ele. Jornalista, crítico musical. Desde 2008, ele é repórter da prestigiosa revista New Yorker. Trabalhou também como crítico musical, crítico de música pop, do New York Times, por 6 anos. Na carreira, como ele mesmo diz, ele teve a alegria de assistir muitos shows e ser pago para ouvir e escrever opinião sobre música. Nesse primeiro livro que ele traz para a gente, Na Trilha do Pop, a música do século XX, em 7 gêneros, ele vai costurando as memórias, com análises musicais e também reflexões sobre a sociedade, porque a música faz essa ligação, ajuda a gente a fazer toda essa conexão. Ele vai fazendo, vai ligando os pontos. Bom, ele já disse também que o objetivo do livro é entender o que as pessoas andam escutando por aí e por quê. Vocês já pensaram nisso? O que vocês andam escutando e por quê? Então aqui essa mesa vai ser uma mesa interessante, porque o Kelefa é um jornalista que tem um ouvido aberto, uma alma aberta. Não é o tipo de crítico musical que fica ali tentando encontrar um lugar só para criticar. Temos aí um lugar também da crítica musical aí, mas ele é muito interessado no que está acontecendo. Então a gente vai conversar aqui com esse jornalista que cultivou uma devoção ao punk na adolescência, né? Acha o hip hop o gênero mais empolgante do mundo, mas se casou ao som de música country. Ouviu muito James Taylor em casa, ouve música eletrônica enquanto escreve, gosta da Anitta, do funk carioca e de tudo ainda que vai ser criado, transformado e modificado, porque estilo retrô não é com ele. Kelefa, bem-vindo à Flip, bem-vinda para ti.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you. When I was writing this book, I wasn't sure that anyone would ever read it, and I didn't even dream or imagine that it would be translated into Portuguese and that people would be interested in it in Brazil. So this is beyond a dream come true because it's a dream I didn't even know I had.
E nós também temos, é claro, mas porque a música fala com a gente. Bom, o Kelefa fez esse livro aqui, na trilha do pop. Vou colocar aqui em cima um livro de responsa. Muito bem. Bom, hoje, se a gente reparar, tipo, nas paradas, está cada vez mais difícil a gente identificar que gênero musical é daquela música ou que aquele cantor transita dentro da cultura pop, né? As coisas estão se misturando, estão ficando cada vez mais híbridas. E aí ele traz essa história da música popular americana a partir do século XX, né? A partir de 7 gêneros musicais. E o que ele tenta fazer, o que ele faz, é relacionar a história, ajudar a gente a entender a história desses gêneros, para a gente também entender como é que a gente chegou até aqui, nesse momento em que a cultura pop tem esse hibridismo, né? Então, eu queria começar perguntando sobre isso. Falar sobre gêneros é falar sobre identidade cultural, né? E eu queria que você falasse mais sobre isso. No seu livro, você afirma que, desde os anos de 1960, a música vem sendo usada como forma de auto-identificação.
Yes.
Então, gênero também é falar sobre gêneros musicais, é falar sobre identidade cultural.
Yes, you said earlier when you were talking about the way that music can create connections with people. But I'm interested as well in the opposite, in the way that music can create disconnection, right? Sometimes we use music because we want to be part of a community. We want to join with other people who are listening. But sometimes part of the fun of listening to music is we use it to separate ourselves. Oh. Don't hurt her. It's a surgical operation.
Sim, mas estou bem. Vai dar tudo certo. Opa! É porque vocês não estavam me ouvindo bem, né? Era para vocês me ouvirem melhor. Acho que agora melhorou. Sim? Sim, né? Desculpe interromper.
No, so sometimes we do use music to create disconnection, right? To say, sometimes we use it to say, I want to be part of this world. But sometimes we use it to say, I don't want to be part of this world. I don't like these people. I don't want to listen to the music that they listen to. I want to listen to something else. That was important for me as a teenager when I discovered punk rock. And what was exciting about punk rock was the idea that you could reject everything. I don't want to listen to what my parents listened to, right? My parents came from Africa to America. They listened to some African music, some classical music, the Beatles. And I was saying, I don't want to listen to any of that stuff. I'm never going to listen to the Beatles. You know, my friends were listening to what was popular at school, and I would say, I don't want to listen to what my friends, I'm not like those people. I'm different, right? And that desire to say, I'm different, is one of the important drivers of musical history and of culture in general, right? We want these two things from music. We want that feeling of connection at certain times, but at other times we want that feeling of disconnection, of pulling away. And you see that again and again in musical history. You mentioned right now we're kind of living through a moment where things are mixing, right, where genres are sort of coming together. It reminds me in some ways of the 1970s, right? In the 1970s, the late 1970s, the disco era. You had all sorts of music coming together, and it felt like everyone was making disco records, right? It was R&B singers, it was rock bands. The Rolling Stones have a disco record. There's a Star Wars disco record. In America, Latin music is finally coming into the mainstream through disco. European electronic producers are making disco. Everyone's coming together on the dance floor. And what happens next is a backlash, right? What happens next is people saying, I don't want to be with everyone else. I don't want to listen to this disco crap that everyone's listening to. In America, there's a movement that called disco sucks. And the idea, part of the idea was, I don't like this idea of people coming together. I want to be different. I want to be off in my own place doing my own thing. And so it's a push and pull force within music that creates all these different musical genres for us to listen to, right? The reason there are all these different genres is because there are these different communities that are trying to separate themselves from each other, right? Trying to say, I don't want to listen to James Taylor. I'm a death metal fan. And it's fun for someone like me to be able to jump in and out. I listen to death metal, I listen to James Taylor, I listen to all sorts of stuff. But it's also good to remember that we wouldn't have all these different genres, all these different communities, if it weren't for that desire to set ourselves apart and to pull ourselves apart. And so part of the reason I wrote this book is because people are always saying that music brings us together. Sometimes. But sometimes it pushes us apart. And that push and pull is really what creates the diverse world of music that we have.
Sim, você disse, inclusive, voltando a essa história do punk, que o punk te ajuda a amar a música, mas também a odiar a música, né?
Yes, yeah, those are together, right? If you meet someone that really loves music and they say they love absolutely everything, that's someone with no taste. That's someone who maybe doesn't love music that much. And when you talk to the people who care the most about music, they tend to have strong opinions about what they like and what they don't like.
Sim, agora, muitos bom, a gente, durante a vida, e um pouco do nome dessa mesa, é sobre o que eu vou falar. Durante a vida, a gente vai passando por vários gêneros musicais, né? Na adolescência, você gosta de algo e, às vezes, você deixa de gostar disso, né? E eu queria saber se tem algum artista ainda que você gosta desde a adolescência, por exemplo, e que você continua gostando. Tem algo que, para você, ainda é perene?
You know, for me, it's more about addition than subtraction. I still love most of what I loved as a teenager. Sometimes the silliest and most teenage music, you know, is the stuff that lasts the best. But for me, what it was a journey, right? The idea of punk rock, the idea of saying, I'm going to not listen to something, I'm going to listen to something else. I'm going to rebel, right? I'm going to like music that embraces defiance and rebellious and going against the rules. That's nice for a few years, but then of course you realize punk rock has rules too. So what would it be like to rebel against the rules of punk? When I first started listening to dancehall reggae music and some electronic music, I said, oh, this is even more radical than punk rock. When I got back into hip-hop, which I'd loved as a boy in America in the 1980s, hip-hop was popular music. It was on TV, it was on the radio, it seemed kind of normal to me. And it was only through listening to punk that I could come back and realize how radical hip-hop really was, how rebellious it really was, how weird it really was. And so realizing that in some ways maybe hip-hop is more punk than punk rock. And to go even further, if punk rock means breaking the rules or not doing what's expected, maybe the most punk rock form of music would be something like country music, would be something that seems very conservative, right? If you're in the world, in the milieu of punk rock, country music might seem rebellious. It might seem difficult, right? These are people that are different from the people you grew up around. So to me, punk rock was really a lens for me to understand all sorts of music and learn to love all sorts of music, which again took me a while because when I was 14, I hated everything except punk rock.
Muito bom. Agora, você fala sempre que, e no seu livro você vai falando pra gente, em cada um dos gêneros, existe também uma proteção. Cada gênero, de alguma forma, ou uma facção desse gênero musical, tenta se proteger. Tenta se proteger e criar regras para que essa autenticidade seja ali totalmente verificada, né? Então, é possível a gente ter e exigir desses gêneros esse purismo?
You know, I think most people are familiar with the fact that if you want to have a good party or a good nightclub, you need someone working the door. You need a bouncer, right? Now, maybe if you're just having some friends over, you don't need a security guard at the door, because not many people are going to show up. But the bigger it gets, the more you're going to maybe need security, and you're going to need some way to decide who's in and who's out. So it's possible to say everyone's welcome. But if everyone actually wants to show up, then you don't have an intimate party anymore. You just have the whole world. And so this is something that musical genres deal with. Some musical genres do this by making music that is so unpleasant that most people don't want to listen to it. And other musical genres have an issue where when they become popular, they have to decide, well, who's allowed in, who's not allowed in? Because one of the things we like from music is that sense of intimacy, right? That sense that you're entering a world and you relate to the people in that world. It could be in pop music, it could be that only the most intense fans are part of the inner circle, right? Or it could even be in pop music, you're deciding, well, only the artists that have a #1 hit are really the defining pop artists. And so to have the pop world, you've got to have some artists that flop so that others succeed. But you have to have some way of deciding who's in and who's out. You have to have exclusion as well as inclusion to create a space. And I think that's true in human society in general, and it's also true in music. And at the same time, a lot of us aren't that comfortable with that idea, right? We don't like the idea that there's someone guarding the door, that there's a bouncer, that there's some mean guy at the door keeping people out, right? We like to imagine that everyone's welcome, but that said, when our favorite bar or a favorite club gets overrun with people we don't like, you know, we think, this doesn't feel like my crowd anymore. This doesn't feel like a nice place. And so different genres deal with that in their own way, right? In punk rock, people are always arguing about, well, this is true punk rock, this is not true punk rock. But, you know, hip-hop has those rules, too, about what's real hip-hop, what's not hip-hop. Even something like R&B, which, you know, in America is still really a black genre. You know, when you have a pop star, when you have Justin Bieber come along making hits, there are people in the R&B world saying, this isn't really R&B, this is maybe pop music, this is something else. And so, yeah, again, in order for these genres to exist as communities, because I think these musical genres, the reason they're important is they're communities, they're groups of people. And so anytime you have groups of people, you have some attempt to figure out what is this group, and who's in this group and who's not.
Sim, e os artistas? Bom, eu entrevisto alguns cantores também, você já entrevistou também muitos, e sempre que você pede para que algum artista se coloque, na maior parte das vezes, se coloque e diga qual é o gênero, é algo que causa um estranhamento. Ah, não sei, isso é a sua função, eu não sei dizer. Ao mesmo tempo, eles partiram de um gênero, né? A gente pode dizer isso, né? Partiram de um gênero e também esse gênero de onde eles partiram é o lugar que os ajuda nessa questão da identidade, de ter essa identidade musical. É necessário você partir de algum lugar, sim?
Yeah, I mean, usually most artists do come from somewhere, and I've had the experience that you've probably had too, where you talk to an artist, whether it's me talking to Jay-Z or talking to the country star Morgan Wallen, and they say, man, I just make music. It's just music. Why do we have to have these categories? But at the same time, if I were to say to Jay-Z, I don't think you're really a hip-hop act, or to say to Morgan Wallen, you're not really a country singer, they'd be like, hey, wait a second, no. Who are you to tell me I'm not part of that? Because artists want these two things, right? They want that sense of belonging and inclusion, and they want freedom. And there's a tension between those two things. There's a tension between being part of a community and being totally free. And it's a feeling that I think most of us have in our normal lives. We have communities that we're part of, And sometimes we love being part of that community, whether it's a church or a friend group or whatever it is. And sometimes it feels confining, it feels restricting, right? I'm sick of everyone knowing all my business. And so that feeling of wanting to be part of a community and also wanting to be free, you know, there's a push-pull there that a lot of artists feel, and at different times they might emphasize more wanting to be part of the community or wanting to be kind of free off on their own.
Sim, agora, pensando no gênero pop, um exemplo que você dá no livro é do Boy George. Aí você está falando isso, eu pensei nisso. O Boy George é um cantor, e é um cantor que ele disse, eu sou pop. E foi a primeira vez, talvez, assim, de forma consciente, que alguém pôde dizer isso e assumir. Isso também é importante, e é um outro caminho, né?
Yeah, I mean, pop in the 1970s was often an insult, right? The idea of pop is, well, you're not really a rock band, you're just pop. You used to be country, then you went pop. You're not really R&B, you're just pop. And the idea was to be pop was to be homeless, was to not have a home because you're just out there trying to make hits. No community is going to claim you. You're just pop. And so, of course, what happens is that pop sort of becomes its own community. So that in the 1980s, you get people saying, no, I'm proud to be a pop singer, right? This is, and you get a series of sounds, right? If you think about the Madonna records of the 1980s, that helps define what pop sounds like. And nowadays, if you have a singer who says, yes, I'm a pop singer, probably they sound a little bit like Madonna, right? Probably they have a little bit of that sound that was created in the 1980s. And so it's an example of how even when you try to get outside of a community, a new community ends up forming, because this is what we do as human beings, we form communities.
Sim, sim. Nesse caso da comunidade, pensando nesse gênero pop, dos gêneros que você tem aqui, é o mais fresco. É o mais recente. E por causa disso, ele carrega, na sua opinião, que características? É um gênero ainda em transição? Ou ele, por si só, já é essa mistura, como você falou?
Well, every genre is always in transition, and to different extents, right? Rock and roll, which at one point seemed like kind of the new thing, kind of has become the most traditional of these major genres, right? If you meet someone today who says they're a big fan of rock music, they probably like the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin and the Beatles, right? They probably like bands that were popular 50 years ago. Maybe they like some new stuff too. But rock and roll kind of stays with a particular sound, right? Literally a drummer, a bass player, a guitarist, a singer. Whereas country music, for example, in the US, really changes a lot more, because country music is defined more by the audience. So there are these people that think of themselves as country music fans, and whatever they like, whatever sound they enjoy, that's what country music is going to be. It might all of a sudden have electric guitars, it might have drum machines, people might even be rapping. But as long as these people like it, it's going to be country music. So some genres are defined more by the community. Or you think about dance music, right, where all sorts of different kinds of music can get into house or get into techno. But if it's playing at the club, if people are dancing, then it really is dance music in a sense. And again, we can argue, I love to argue, about what the rules are. And you could break it down, you could do 77 genres instead of 7, right? Or you could be a classical music fan, and to a classical music fan, maybe all of this stuff is just one genre, right? It all seems like popular music. So you can definitely make finer distinctions, or you can make broader distinctions. But I think once you get into these communities, and what I try to do in the book is, you realize that over the decades there is a dialogue. So if you're making hip-hop music in the 2020s, there is a sense that you're aware of what was happening maybe in the 2010s or the 2000s. You're building upon some things even as you're changing it, right? Even as Young Thug or Lil Uzi Vert doesn't sound like Jay-Z, and Jay-Z didn't sound like De La Soul, and De La Soul didn't sound like the Sugar Hill Gang, right? So it's always changing, but there is a sense of dialogue and a sense of, oh, we're part of this same tradition. And so the other reason why I structured the book the way I did was to be able to tell those stories so that you can really see at different points, here are the arguments that people are having. And sometimes when you look at a community, at the arguments that people are having, that's a good way to figure out what that community values. right? By looking at what they're willing to argue about. And as long as those arguments are happening, the community is probably still alive, right? When people stop arguing, that's when the community is dead.
Sim. Tem uma questão muito interessante nesses 50 anos, e é o que a gente está vivendo, que é a mudança de como a gente ouve a música, né? Então, a gente está fazendo essa discussão sobre as comunidades, e as comunidades, nesses últimos 50 anos, está ouvindo música de forma diferente, a música chega de forma diferente. E no seu livro, você fala sobre isso, você fala sobre o que você chama da cultura da escassez, né? Que a gente, no início dos anos 70, começa a consumir, a pesquisar e a ir atrás de música a partir de uma base e a partir da escassez, a partir... É isso, poucos discos, as lojas, onde conseguir, quem tem essa música, quem tem esse disco, como eu posso conseguir, onde estão as novidades. Isso também moldou algumas gerações e os gêneros e as criações dentro desses gêneros, não?
Yeah, I mean, you're making me feel old because I'm old enough that I remember this culture of scarcity. I remember my mother giving me $5 for lunch when I went downtown with my friends, and I said, wait a second, we have food at home, we don't have that many records at home, I'm just going to spend this $5 on a record, and I'll skip lunch, I'll eat double dinner maybe. And so this idea that you really had to pick and choose, and you had to make a decision, you had to be really careful. And maybe, I think anyone who is my age or older will remember the feeling of spending your hard-earned money on an album, and you play it, and it sounds bad. And you're like, oh. And maybe you spend a couple weeks listening to it over and over again to try and figure out if you're going to like it. Can you convince yourself to like it? I remember Run DMC, Tougher Than Leather, the 4th Run DMC album. I remember being so excited to buy this record. And I bought it, and it sounded terrible. And I tried to convince myself to listen to it. I could never quite fall in love with it. And so that's a different relationship to music, whereas now you can try everything, you can sample everything. Every Friday, if you belong to a streaming service, you can just listen to all the new music. And so we're still trying to figure out, well, what does that mean, right? And you do see these boundaries blurring because nowadays you can kind of skip around, listen to a bit of this, listen to a bit of that. But again, for a lot of us, listening to music is something we do. It's not always an end of itself. It's a way we connect to other people, right? Part of the fun of listening to music is imagining ourselves into that community, right? You listen to a metal band and you become the kind of person who listens to metal. You become part of that community, even if it's just in your head, even if it's just for half an hour. And so what you find is that even now, where we don't have this culture of scarcity, people still like to form those connections, and it captures their imagination to think about, well, what does this say about me? That I'm a fan of Lil Uzi Vert, or I'm a fan of Taylor Swift, or I'm a fan of this artist or that one. What am I part of? What tribe am I joining? And so that's what people are trying to figure out now is how do these boundaries, what kind of boundaries do you see in a time of a culture of non-scarcity, a time of listening to everything? You know, when you go to a service like Spotify, you can pick by genre, right? You can listen to the country or the hip-hop, or you can pick by mood, right? You can say, I just want to listen to some chill music, and you can click on chill. And of course, what you started to see happen was like maybe chill becomes a genre. There's the Norwegian producer Kygo got really popular because his tracks were popular in the chill genre. And so people are showing up to his concerts. And so, and I talked to him about this, and I went to see him, and part of what I was interested in is, oh, is this maybe becoming a community? Is chill becoming a community? And, you know, again, if you think about these distinctions, it can seem silly to argue over these musical distinctions, but if you think of them as communities, then to ask if they're going away is a little bit like asking if human communities are going away, right? They can't go away. That's what we do as people, is we form these groups. So that's what's been fun for me to see. But I should say, as an older person, it still seems like a miracle to me that I can go online and listen to all sorts of music for, you know, $10 a month or something. I can stuff myself. It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet. And I still can't quite believe it because I remember what it used to be like to save up $5 or $10 to buy one album that might be bad.
Sim, e você tem essa experiência também de ter trabalhado em loja de disco, né? Você trabalhou numa
Yeah.
loja de disco durante um ano. Inclusive, você saiu
I,
da...
I tried not to be a jerk.
Você fez um ano sabático na universidade, saiu um ano da universidade para ficar numa loja, ouvindo música, conversando com as pessoas. E mais o quê? Por que é que você quis ficar nessa loja? Por quê? E o que isso acrescentou para você?
Well, to me, I was studying literature at Harvard, but to me, that information I was getting from novels and classes was just less interesting to me than the information I was getting from records and, selling records, buying records, talking to customers about records. And again, it's maybe hard to imagine now, but it was hard to get access to music. So the idea that I could be in this shop listening to records all day, touching records all day, right, just being around it was so exciting to me. And I really wasn't kidding when I said I tried not to be a jerk. I think a lot of people know the stereotype of the grumpy guy behind the counter at the record store who's judging you, right? And you want to buy this thing, and he's like, oh, that's not cool. And I never wanted to be that person, although I should say, it's really difficult, right? When a customer would come up to the counter and say, like, don't you love this band? And you'd say, because I don't want to lie to them.
Claro.
But I also don't want to say, it's hard to say, well, that's great that you like it, I don't like it, but it's still okay, right? These judgments feel very personal because music is so personal. And when someone says, I don't like this song you like, I don't like this record you like, what you hear is, I don't like you. I don't like people like you. I'm different than you. I'm better than you. And, what you hear is snobbery. And this is a term I've thought a lot about, snob. Because I'm not sure there's any way to have any opinion about music without being a snob, right? We all deep down have music that we like better than other music. And intellectually we understand, we agree, everyone's different. But on some fundamental level, when you play a song you love for someone and they don't get it, you think, oh. And when they play some terrible song that they love, that you don't love, you say, what is wrong with this person? And, that's part of the fun of listening to music. And again, we can be polite about it. We can say, oh, well, I haven't really gotten into that. I need to spend more time listening to that. It hasn't really connected with me. But what you're really thinking deep down is, ugh.
E essa fala me leva para uma pergunta sobre o seu papel como crítico, né?
Uhum.
Você disse que não queria ser esse vendedor mal-humorado e...
I want to be a little grumpy.
Um pouquinho, ok. Só um pouquinho mal-humorado. Mas, como crítico, você também tem que ter... tem que seguir por que caminhos? Qual o seu caminho para a crítica?
Well, the first critics I ever saw were Statler and Waldorf, who are the two critics on The Muppet Show in the US. They sit up in the box in the theater, and all they do is insult the Muppets. And, so there was something about that seemed funny to me and fun to me, but I thought of my job as trying to figure out how I could enjoy this thing that everyone's enjoying, and trying to think about what is it that people love about this music, and is there a way for me to love it too? In a sense, it's greedy, right? It's like you see a bunch of people eating food, and you think like, oh, could I get that in my belly as well? And so, yeah, I kind of got less grumpy over the years as a critic. I did sometimes have that reaction where I'd go see... I remember one of the last concerts I ever reviewed for the New York Times was James Blunt, the English singer. And I went to see James Blunt, and I was just like, no. But more often, when you're at the concert and you're surrounded by people who love it, it's easier for you to understand, oh, here's what they're reacting to. Here's what they love. Oh, there's something in it I didn't understand. And that was some of the most fun experiences I had, was going to see Bette Midler or something, or someone I'd never listened to, and getting engrossed in the music and spending a few hours watching them on stage and being like, oh, I understand now. I didn't understand before. And so I came to think of it as sometimes it feels like it's not music I hate and music I love, but music I love and music I haven't learned to love, and maybe one day in the future I could learn to love it. And again, I think that comes from starting my journey in loving music as a punk rocker and then just sort of expanded. And there's still stuff that I listen to that still sounds bad to me. There's still prejudices I have as a critic. I have a hard time listening to music that feels very retro, where people are trying to just recreate an earlier era, and they're wearing like old-fashioned clothes and old-fashioned hats, and they're using old-fashioned language. That seems corny to me often.
Deixa eu tentar entender esse estilo retrô que você está falando. A Amy Winehouse faz parte desse estilo?
I've never fully connected with the music of Amy Winehouse.
Justamente por isso. Justamente porque você não via uma conexão com o tempo de hoje?
Yeah, I don't know, I felt like I could hear the thing that she was evoking. And that was less exciting to me in that world of R&B than listening to like Erykah Badu, who felt like she was exploring outer space, and I was hearing something I'd never heard before. But even, I saw Amy Winehouse, and I kind of could sort of understand some of what people were getting from it, but my personal taste has always been, something that feels a little newer and a little weirder. But, the thing about music is, we all have personal taste and things we like and things we don't like. I don't think there's anything besides that. I don't think there's any other scale of like, well, this is good, but I don't like it, or this is lousy, but it's a guilty pleasure and I do like it. I think all there is what we like and what we don't like. And so, when I say that I don't really connect with the music of Amy Winehouse, what I'm really saying deep down is that I don't think it's good. And I'm saying that in a more polite way. But that's kind of what I'm saying. And I think everyone sitting here has some music that everyone else likes that they don't really like. And deep down, again, they can be polite, but deep down what that feeling is like, I don't think this is good. I think you're wrong about this. And this idea that we all think that other people are wrong all the time is part of the fun, because it's part of the way that we can differentiate ourselves, right? I think a lot of us still have that sense that our musical taste is personal, right? Is personal to us, says something about who we are. But for that to be true, we have to like different stuff than other people, right? If we all like the same stuff, then music wouldn't be personal anymore. So the only way for music to be personal is for us to disagree with other people, so that way we have different things that we like.
Bom, você gosta muito de hip hop.
I do.
Sim,
And so you'd like me to start rapping right now? That's what you're asking?
Opa, nós gostaríamos. Por favor. Sim.
No. This is my promise to you. I will never rap.
Peraí, a banda que você teve... Opa, caiu aqui. Você também já se aventurou na música na adolescência. Você cantava rap?
No, I played in some very terrible punk rock bands.
Muito ruim. Oh, ok. Vamos voltar para o hip hop, então.
Objectively terrible.
Qual é o nome da banda? Qual é o nome da banda? Fiquei curiosa.
No, it doesn't matter. Not relevant.
Deve ser aqueles nomes de banda de punk rock, assim, maravilhosos. Muito bem, voltamos ao hip hop. O hip hop, a cultura hip hop, vamos começar pela definição. É difícil. A gente pode dizer que a cultura hip hop, ela é uma cultura da juventude negra, ou o hip hop é só cantar rap?
Yeah, it's two different ways of thinking about hip-hop. Exactly as you said, hip-hop is a culture, and in the US it's a culture that's very much associated with young black people, usually living in big cities, often in poor neighborhoods. And then hip-hop is a practice, right? Hip-hop is rapping. And often those things go together, right? Most of the great rap albums are coming out of this culture, but sometimes they separate a little bit. In the US, one of the first hip-hop hits, popular hip-hop tracks, was Rapture by Blondie, right? This white punk pop group. And I think in the early days, people thought maybe these things would separate. Just as rock and roll in the old days was kind of considered a black genre. You think about Ike Turner, you think Sister Rosetta, and these black pioneers of rock and roll. By the 70s, it kind of comes to be perceived as a white genre. And I think in the early days, it seemed like hip-hop was going to follow this trajectory. It was this music that was created in the South Bronx by Black and Hispanic people, and then it was going to turn into maybe a white thing or a novelty thing. And what's really interesting about hip-hop is that never happened. It's been 50 years, and this is still music that's closely identified with Black communities in poor neighborhoods. Those are still many of the biggest stars. It still has this organic connection to the culture, and so it's still powerful as a cultural force, even as these two definitions split a little bit. What I mean is, you have hip-hop stars now, you think of someone like Travis Scott, who doesn't really rap, right? And it's recognizably hip-hop because of the culture, even if he's doing something that feels a little more like singing than rapping, right? In the 2000s, you started having this thing where singers would rap. You know, it was Andre 3000, it was Kanye West, now it's Drake, of course. Half the time he's singing, not rapping, but he still feels like part of the hip-hop culture. So it's this fascinating thing that has retained this cultural specificity, such that in the US, even people who aren't Black, when they're rapping, often they're using some of those rhythms, they're using some of those slangs, they're using some of that body music. And that's partly because part of the genius of hip-hop is it takes some of the rhythm that was already there in Black speech patterns, right? In African American speech, there is rhythm, and hip-hop musically is built on those rhythms in that speech. And so when you do it in a different language, even in a different accent, the music tends to sound different. And that's why some of the greatest music that's been inspired by hip-hop all over the world sounds different, right? Whether it's funk karaoke, whether it's Kwaito in South Africa, all these different places have things that sound a little bit different because the language is a little bit different, because one of the genius inventions of hip-hop is to take music that's embedded in the language and to capitalize on that music, so that that when someone says a sentence, there's some music in that. And that's one of the things that's really brilliant about hip-hop, and I think that's one of the things that has kept hip-hop so closely tied in America to this Black culture in America.
Sim, agora, ao mesmo tempo que o hip-hop também passou desse lugar, desse nascimento na festa, no gueto, identificado a essa juventude negra, como também uma cultura que domina o mainstream mundial. Né?
Yeah.
E qual é o próximo passo?
Well, you know, it dominates the mainstream, but it also has always inspired people to want to make it their own, right? And so you've seen the music change. Even in the US, hip-hop is kind of born in New York, and you saw in the US when it spreads to the West Coast, to California, again, people talk a little bit differently there, and the music sounds different. And then when it spreads down south to Houston and to Atlanta and to southern cities, that music sounds different too, because there are different accents and different speech patterns down there. And so a lot of my favorite, as I said, hip-hop inspired music around the world, you know, has sounded local, right? Has sounded not like, oh, we're imitating something from New York. It sounded like, no, this is local, both in the sense that we're drawing on our own language and traditions, but also in the sense that we're speaking to other people in the neighborhood. One of the funny things about hip-hop is from when hip-hop first started, there had been a desire among some of the people who celebrated it for it to be very political. And the thing about political music is it's often addressed to the outside world, right? It's let me tell you what's happening in my neighborhood. Let me tell you what needs to change in my neighborhood. But often when people are talking to each other within the community, it's not that, right? It's something a little bit different. And often what you've seen in hip-hop is it sounds like you're eavesdropping on a conversation that's happening within the community. Sometimes just talking about nothing in particular, sometimes bragging, sometimes lying, sometimes, you know, just making threats and making claims, and because that's how people would talk if they were just talking to each other. And so the fact that hip-hop, even as it gets super global, still feels so local, right? You listen to a Young Thug record, and you feel like you're just overhearing some guys in Atlanta talking about what's going on in their lives. That's really been the key to its success, is that it stayed super local even as it went hyper-global. And again, I think in music in general, one of the interesting things about a golden age is often people don't realize it's happening while it's happening. I don't know exactly the discussion here, but in the US, the discussion of hip-hop has always been disapproving. At every step in the evolution of hip-hop in America, there have been people saying, they're not rapping about what they should be rapping about, or it's too much money, or it's too much guns, or it's too sexist, or it's too something. It's not quite what it could be. Even though, as we look back, it's hard not to be amazed by this. And so when I think about hip-hop, I really think about living through a golden age, living through this time when the most popular genre worldwide is associated with working-class black communities creating their own form of poetry that people are obsessed with. And so I always feel like really lucky to be alive at the time when that's the case. And I imagine future generations looking back and saying, really? Poetry was that popular in those communities when you were alive? And I said, yeah, it's amazing.
Sim. E tem uma questão importante dentro dessa discussão é a gente entender como esses artistas de hip hop, os artistas negros, talvez também de outros gêneros aqui, como eles têm essa criação potente, têm uma posição importante dentro da música popular, mas nem sempre são reconhecidos e remunerados como outros artistas que vêm de outros gêneros e de outras culturas, né?
Well, yeah, there's two parts of this, right? One is that the music industry is an industry, and it was generally never created by artists. It was created by business people trying to make money, and so artists have tried to find a way to fit in, tried to figure out how to make their records and get paid, but it was never really created with them in mind. And so they've never really felt like they're getting compensated the way they should in any genre. In the US, obviously, it's a particular issue with hip-hop, and I think you have to zoom out a little bit and look at the numbers, right? In the US, the black population is 12 or 13% of the population. It's a minority. And so there's always been a question for black musicians in the US about the audience. Who is your audience? And if you're making music for a majority black audience, then that's going to be a small audience. And if you're making music for everyone to enjoy and find a big audience, that's going to be a majority white audience. And that might change the kind of music that you think you're making. And that might be an audience and that fact might mean that white musicians maybe have more success. It's not a coincidence that despite the fact that hip-hop remains this black form, some of the top-selling rap albums of all time in America are by white acts, the Beastie Boys or Eminem. And, that's not a coincidence, and that's part of what it means to be a minority in a country, is that you're always trying to figure out, how do I relate to the mainstream? Do I take pride in the fact that I'm making quote-unquote black music? Or am I trying to tell people no, this is music for everyone, that everyone should enjoy? There was a time in the US on the pop charts, we have an R&B chart that measures the most popular R&B records in the country. And in the early 1980s, the magazine that compiles the chart renamed it Black Music. And some artists thought this was great because we're acknowledging the community that creates this music. And to some artists, it felt like segregation. Don't put me over here. You don't have a white music chart, so why are you putting us over here in the black music chart? And even more individually, when you look at the stories of some of these artists, I write in the book about Luther Vandross, the great R&B singer, who never had a #1 pop hit. And that kind of ate at him because he felt like he should be a pop star, but he really wasn't a pop star. He was an R&B star. He was #1 in his world. On the other hand, Whitney Houston, it was the opposite, right? Whitney Houston had huge success among pop listeners, which is to say white listeners, from the moment she came out. And there was a perception that maybe she wasn't a real R&B artist because her music was too pop. And so she actually tried on her third album to really turn that around and become more of an R&B artist, right? Because she wanted to make sure that she was accepted and embraced within that community. And so, that goes back to what I was saying before of artists wanting to be part of communities and also wanting to be free to talk to everyone. But with race, obviously, it's more pointed because there is the question of, well, what does it mean? What would it mean for a country to celebrate an artist from a minority group? What would it mean from that group to be fairly compensated? And what would that mean for the way we think about music? I think it's easy and important for us to look at hip-hop and R&B and recognize and celebrate the fact that these are black genres. These are black communities where many of the musicians and the listeners are black. But in the US, where, as I say, black people are 12 or 13% of the population, if you have black genres, numerically, that means you're going to have white genres. You're going to have disproportionately white genres. And country music is a great example. And over the years, that's been an ongoing discussion within country music. Should we celebrate the fact that we're a white genre? Should we be proud to be a white genre? Or should we want our genre to be more diverse? And if we want country music to be more diverse and to have more non-white performers in it, should we also want R&B and hip-hop to be more diverse and have more non-black performers in it? So depending on the moment, there's times when we might celebrate the fact that certain genres, certain communities have a racial identity, or we might bemoan that fact. But part of what I love about music is that it reflects the way we live. So in America, if we are still, in 2023, living lives that are somewhat segregated, I want music that reflects that. I want to be able to hear all of that, the good and the bad, coming through the speakers, coming from music.
Sim, e eu acho que todos nós aqui estamos pensando um pouco sobre... Nós somos maioria no Brasil, né? Uma maioria negra, e ainda assim a música negra ainda sofre muitos percalços e desafios. Os artistas negros ainda sofrem muitas questões. Muitas questões chegando aqui também. Vou separar algumas para falar para vocês, nos nossos últimos 15 minutos. Mas enquanto eu separo aqui, eu queria que você falasse com a gente, e você falou da Whitney Houston, e eu fiquei pensando em todas as outras estrelas do rock, do pop, do R&B, que você vai falando no livro, que você vai citando para a gente. E eu queria que você falasse um pouco sobre a diferença entre ser uma estrela do rock e uma estrela do pop hoje, por exemplo. As pessoas que estão ali recebendo os holofotes, os artistas, essas estrelas da música, vivem num ambiente diferente hoje, não? É um ambiente diferente ou é a mesma coisa para você?
Yeah, no, I think one of the biggest changes is that it's become a little more interactive. Right? In the old days, we didn't know that much about musicians, right? If you're a big fan, you might collect every interview that your favorite musician did. That might be 5 or 6 interviews over the course of a year or 2 years, right? We didn't know that much about them. We didn't know how they felt about all these political issues. And with social media, there is this sense of intimacy, or maybe faux intimacy, maybe pretend intimacy. So we feel like we know them. We feel like we're in dialogue with them. When I was a music critic at the New York Times in the 2000s, I tried not to become like friends with the artist. I tried not to go backstage. Occasionally, I'd be in the studio with them to see how they worked, but usually I tried to keep some distance because I wanted to be able to say if the new album was lousy, I wanted to say like, this is a terrible album, and not feel like I was betraying a friendship. But I think nowadays it's very different, because if you say something, even just a regular person says something about an artist, the artist might respond on Twitter, right? All of a sudden, it's the difference between me and you talking about someone hundreds of miles away, and that person standing right there with us, and we're saying, oh yeah, his book stinks. And he's like, hey, wait a second, I heard that. And so the idea that every artist is potentially part of every conversation we have about every artist has kind of changed the way we think about music, and has changed the job, right? Part of the job of being a star now, rock star, pop star, any kind of star, is to manage that relationship with fans, is to think about how much you interact with them, how much content you give them, what you say to them, what you share. And you know, sometimes there might be demand for a star to have political positions in a way that wouldn't have existed 20 years ago. How come you haven't spoken up about this? How come you haven't mentioned that? What's your view on this thing? And so, you know, it reminds me a little bit of when MTV came out. I think it came here, around 1990. I first got it in 1989. And with MTV, all of a sudden, you're seeing music videos, and it's this whole new area of creativity, and you get a whole generation of stars who are really good at making videos. And you had the grumpy people saying, oh, this is terrible. Now it's all about image. It's not about real music anymore. But of course, looking back, you look at someone like Madonna, who was great at making music videos, and you say, oh, this was just a new art form, and there were people that were really good at it. I think something similar is true with social media, right? There's a generation of artists who were really good at social media and finding ways to be expressive and creative on social media, and that's part of the job. And if you hate that part of a job, then it seems like things have gotten worse. But for some artists that find a way to use that, that's just another way for us to create these connections. And again, that kind of connection is a big part of what we're really looking for when we listen to music.
Os artistas pop hoje, eles fundem a arte, negócios, entretenimento e sem culpa, né? Eu acho que também essa é uma questão interessante. E aí a gente pode falar que eles estão tentando traçar outra discussão, que é sobre excelência e popularidade?
Yeah, you mean in terms of what's good and what's popular? Well, yeah, I mean, in a sense, what's popular is just what most people think is good. And that doesn't mean they're correct, right? They could be wrong. But there's not some other, there's only those two judgments, right? There's the judgment of what you like, and there's a judgment of what everyone likes. But there's not a third scale. There's not some objective way to measure what's actually good and bad that's independent from either what people like or what you yourself hear. So those arguments about popularity and goodness, it comes down to taste, right? One person might love the songs that are on the pop charts and someone else might hate them, and ultimately that's an argument about musical taste and whether stuff sounds good to you. And so, you know, I think in some communities, like the punk rock community, there was a certain fear of popularity, right? An idea that like, oh, the good stuff is not the stuff that's popular. But even that is a little paradoxical, because within the world of punk, there's like a punk song that all the punks like. And that's just a form of popularity, right? That's a kind of a pop chart that exists within the community. So again, popularity and what's good are kind of different ways of saying the same thing, right? Popularity is just a way of aggregating what many people think is good. And again, those people can be wrong. Those people sometimes are wrong, but wrong in the sense of we disagree with them. We have different tastes. And even when music critics write about music, sometimes they have a sense of history, right? There is this idea that maybe in the long run, we'll see. In the long run, we'll see which music really survives, and that's how we're going to tell what's good. And I would even push back against that. What's so great about the long run? Why do we imagine that people in 20 or 30 or 40 years are going to have smarter or better ideas about the music of 2023 than we have right now? Who cares about posterity, maybe, right? Like maybe this view that we have now is the most important view. I've never loved the idea that we're going to leave it to future generations to decide which of our favorite songs are good, because when I see the way people look now at the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, it's a very distorted view of the 60s and 70s and 80s. And that's fine, right? That's fine that opinions change, but I'm not sure that future generations deserve to have the last word.
Muito bom. Bom, tem muitas questões aqui, nós estamos nos 10 minutos, passa rápido, 10 minutos finais. Vou fazer algumas questões que vocês trouxeram, muito legal, muito obrigada. Muita gente querendo saber sobre o rock. Eles querem saber, o rock continua transgressor? Ou esse senso de rebeldia no contexto da música pop para os outros gêneros?
I have two kids, 7 and 11, and to them rock music sounds weird. Like if we're listening to music at home and there's some guitars and someone's really singing like this, they're like, what is this weird music? Because to them, it's hip hop and it's pop. So in that sense, maybe there is a certain transgressive element, but rock and roll really found its identity as a traditional form of music, as a thing you might have noticed starting even in the early 1970s, you start getting rock songs about rock and roll, right? You think, it's been a long time since I rock and rolled, right? And, you know, Crocodile Rock, and it's only rock and roll, but I like it. And so even in the early 1970s, there was this sense that we missed it. The golden age of rock and roll was back there somewhere, and all we can do is hope to revive it. And so from the 1970s on, the history of rock and roll really is a series of revivals. Even punk rock, in a way, was an attempt to revive that older spirit of rock and roll. It's the Ramones singing, "Do you remember rock and roll radio?" Right? And then you get the Strokes and the White Stripes that are very self-consciously evoking older styles and trying to revive it. And now even a band like Måneskin is a band that part of what they're doing is trying to revive older forms of rock and roll, trying to bring that spirit back. And so in that sense, rock and roll continues and it stays alive, but it continues as an ongoing revival, or maybe an ongoing series of revivals. And in that sense, again, it's a very nostalgic and very traditional form of music, but maybe for that reason it's lasted. I mean, one of the biggest rock stars today internationally is Bruce Springsteen, who was a rock star back in the 1970s, and part of what he realized before other people realized was that that the future of rock and roll belonged to the most nostalgic people. And Bruce Springsteen was nostalgic from the start. He came out as a kind of an old-fashioned guy, and because of that, ironically, he doesn't seem any more old-fashioned now than he seemed in the 1970s.
Muito bem. Tem uma questão aqui muito interessante, e eu vou até fazer porque o seu livro começa com uma história bonita, tocante, do seu pai no hospital, e você colocando fones de ouvido para que ele, naquele momento, num momento que ele já não estava consciente, que ele pudesse ouvir as músicas e o fone de ouvido. E aqui tem uma pergunta sobre o fone de ouvido, que eu achei interessante. Qual que é a influência do fone de ouvido para a experiência musical contemporânea? Também pode ser um meio novo de se separar através da música? De estar esse isolamento que você dizia no início, né?
I mean, you see this tradition starting in the 1980s, really, with the birth of the Walkman, although it goes back further than that, right? The idea of anti-social listening experiences, right? I'm going to block out the world and just listen to what I want to listen to. Again, even I would even argue that that is, again, kind of parasocial, because you're walking down the street with your earbuds in, and you're listening to some sort of music, and again, in your mind, you're a little bit transported to that world, to the concert, or to thinking about the artists, or to the community of people. Maybe you walk a little bit different, depending on what kind of music it is. So yes, but it is this idea of individual listening. It's also, you know, I think it's important to different technological forms of listening encourage different musical traditions, right? In the radio, you had what was called the loudness wars, where radio stations wanted to stand out on the dial so they would master music at a really high volume. So, and what you got was, you know, certain guitar frequencies that stood out really well on the radio. And similarly, I think maybe we'll look back and see that, oh, there were certain things that were designed for earpods, and there are certain things, you certainly see that with TikTok, right, where often on TikTok it's the first 10 or 20 seconds of the song. So people in the studio are definitely thinking like, oh, the first 10 or 20 seconds of the song has to be really interesting, or has to be kind of quirky and catchy, because that's what's going to grab people. And I think it's always useful to think about the business of music, right? Because as much as we talk about artistic expression and I had something in my soul, a lot of times people are trying to make hits. They're trying to sell records, they're trying to get streams. And so that collision of art and commerce is, you know, what creates this world of popular music. And often it is both at once. And I'd be interested to read, whoever wrote that question, I'd be interested to read an analysis of the way that different earphones and AirPods have changed how people hear music and the kind of music that people make. Are there some music that are more satisfying to listen to on those little speakers? Are there certain things that would, you know, is a dance music sound better, or do you need those big external speakers to listen to dance music where you can really feel the bass in your chest?
Sim. Então vamos falar, você está falando da sensação da música, dessa experiência, vamos falar de show, porque algumas pessoas têm curiosidade aqui de saber qual foi o show mais memorável que você foi.
Oh man, sometimes the memorable ones are the bad ones. Stage, they were having some sort of dispute. So
wow.
It's hard to get much more memorable than that, yeah.
Agora, tem muitas e muitas questões aqui falando sobre música brasileira. A gente sempre quer saber, quem chega aqui, se escuta e se conhece o Brasil a partir da música. Qual é a sua relação com a música brasileira?
So I'm definitely not an expert.
Ok. Estamos entendendo.
In the old days, it was really difficult. In the 1990s, I remember I had an Argentinian friend who went to Argentina and came back with a cassette of funk karaoke, it blew my mind. I was like, what is this amazing music? And it was hard to find more of it. Now it's a little bit easier to find more of it, so I'm on Spotify and I'm listening to, MC Kevin O'Chris or MC Livigno or something, and I'm keeping up a little bit. As you've probably noticed, I don't speak Portuguese, so I don't hear I can't, unless I go to Google, it's hard to know what they're saying. Obviously, Anita, who hasn't quite broken through to mainstream success in the US, but I love those songs, and I think, obviously there's a potential that she could turn people on to more Brazilian music in the US. In the US, Anglo and Hispanic music used to be really separate. And now with Bad Bunny and Peso Pluma, there's much more music from Latin America that's part of the American mainstream, and it's possible Brazil could be the next wave of that. It's also sometimes the music that travels the best is the music where there's no language barrier. If I think about Sarcófago, the metal band, the fact that
é uma banda rock pesado, metal. Que ele gosta brasileiro. Vocês conhecem essa banda? Sim, claro.
The fact that I can't understand the lyrics is no problem on a Sarcófago album.
Muito bom. Tem mais aqui. Dá tempo de fazer mais uma pergunta aqui. Tantas perguntas interessantes. Vamos lá. Tem uma... Não, é que eu achei aqui. O Bob Dylan, tem aqui a opinião da Morgana, diz que o Bob Dylan é muito popular aqui no Brasil. E, para surpresa dela, ela descobriu que muitos alunos, um professor, adolescentes, são fãs dele. O que você acha que faz com o Dylan seja tão assim atemporal e ouvido aqui no Brasil pelos jovens alunos da Morgana?
That's amazing. I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that because you think of Bob Dylan in the US, there's so much analysis of the lyrics in particular, right? But there is something about his voice and his sensibility, right, that could grab you, maybe even students who are still learning English or who are not catching every single word. And to be honest, many of us native speakers don't really understand Bob Dylan's lyrics anyway. But there's something kind of hard to put into words about Bob Dylan where you feel like, oh, I'm hearing something really true, or I'm hearing something really impressive, even if I can't quite figure out what it is. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I feel like he's trying to tell me something. And there is something that's really, maybe there is something kind of universal about this sense of someone really trying to tell you something, even if you don't know quite what it is. And as I say, certainly I have no idea what Bob Dylan is trying to tell me, and I say that as a fan.
Muito bom. Bom, a última pergunta aqui do público. Mercado, comunidades e crítica. Cooperam ou lutam entre si? Hoje.
Saying markets?
Sim. O mercado da música, as comunidades dos fãs e os jornalistas críticos, o jornalismo crítico. Cooperam ou lutam entre si? Porque hoje existe inclusive, eu vou fazer aqui uma observação, de que os críticos estão só elogiando, tem um pouco de medo dos fãs. Essa relação mercado, comunidade, críticos mudou?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like critic, obviously it's a weird job. Some of us that do the job are weird people. But really, I think of a critic as anyone who has opinions about music, right? Some people get paid for it, we're very lucky, but most of us who listen to music are also critics because we have opinions about it and we have conversations about it. And even, on social media, even the distinction between those of us who get our opinions published and people who don't, I mean, on social media, everything you say is kind of published in a sense. So I define critic very broadly to include everyone who's talking about music. The question of like markets, I don't shy away from that. I think, one thing that a genre is an attempt by the industry to categorize music in order to sell it to us, right? It's partly, a little bit of it's a ploy, right? It's a businesses trying to make money. And the question isn't why do businesses want to make money? They always want to make money. The question is, why is this strategy so effective? Why is this an effective way to sell music? And, we're all being sold to all the time, right? We're all being marketed to all the time. But one of the things I realized pretty early on when I started working as a music critic is that most of these plans fail. Most times the record companies are like, here's our new big star, and people are like, no, not interested. No. And so even the record companies, even these big corporations only have so much control over what people like because people are somewhat unpredictable. It's often the case that the next big star is not who people thought it was going to be. That people arise, there was no master plan behind Bad Bunny that said that this guy Bad Bunny from Puerto Rico is going to be one of the biggest stars in the world, making music that's kind of Latin trap and it's drawn from reggaeton, but it's reaching out to pop and to electronic stuff. No one planned that. And so, and no one planned that this would spark a community, right? That you'd have a sense of identity. You'd have people, instead of it being a little bit separate, you'd have people from different parts of Latin America listening to music from Puerto Rico, but you'd also have non-Spanish speakers around the world listening to that music. And so that's an example of how sometimes a marketing opportunity and a community can kind of go together. And the idea that sometimes you might speak out and get canceled or make some enemies, again, this makes sense because many of our opinions about music, if we're being honest, are somewhat insulting, right? Because many of our opinions about people are somewhat insulting, right? Really, what we actually think about each other, it's a little offensive. And one of the things that music does sometimes is it gives us a chance to express those offensive views in ways that are a little bit less offensive, right? Because it's just music. It's all fun. We can argue about this and not tear each other apart like it's politics, but it is some of those same feelings that drive that political argument are there in music.
Sim, você tem uma visão mais otimista. Para finalizar, quem é a grande estrela da música mundial, na sua opinião, hoje? Beyoncé?
Absolutely Beyonce, although Beyonce has been a star for a long time, right? And if I'm looking at the stories that define this moment, I'm looking at some of the newer acts. I'm looking at Bad Bunny, I'm looking at Karol G, I'm looking at Peso Pluma, I'm looking at Burna Boy from Nigeria. This is really what's defining music now, is that it's so much easier for people to cross over from other countries, to have a musician like Ashake from Nigeria who's making music inspired by South Africa, and he's blowing up in London and in the US. So that is something that wasn't happening on that level 20, 30 years ago. You didn't have musicians from Africa making huge international pop songs. And so when I think about the defining music now, that is one of the things that really has changed and one of the new things that really is happening. And again, what I love about popular music, I get bored very easily. I have a short attention span. And so in popular music, there's always something new happening. There's always something new to figure out. And that's what keeps me excited and probably, as you say, optimistic too.
Foi prazer te ouvir, prazer ouvir você falar sobre música. Kelefa Sanneh, autor de Na Trilha do Pop, a música do século XX em 7 gêneros. Muito obrigada pelo papo, muito obrigada a vocês que participaram. E o Kelefa vai autografar os livros na livraria da Flip e para conversar um pouco com vocês. Um beijo, até a próxima.
Thank you. Obrigado.